Well, welcome back to the Reagan Library. Many of you may not be aware that Ilya has been here many times. This is his first time as a speaker. However, he is no stranger to this beautiful campus. And Ilya, take us back to January of 2022. You fly into Austin, Texas, you send a tweet, you go to sleep, and then what happened?
Well, first of all, Dave, thanks so much for having me. I mean, this is really a dream come true. I immigrated from the Soviet Union with my parents when President Reagan was in the White House, and he's always been a family hero and a hero of mine. And this is a special place, and I've just been delighted to see you at the helm and what you've been doing, and this is truly an honor to be here and to talk about my work, which this work began, as you said, nearly 4 years ago when news of Justice Breyer's retirement broke. And as you noted, my last book and a lot of my work generally is commenting on the Supreme Court. And so it was part of my job description to send a media statement or to do media all that day about what Breyer's legacy, what was to come next, what we could expect from a confirmation battle, et cetera.
And you had just left Cato and were about to start a job.
That's right. This was literally days before I was due to start a new job as head of Georgetown's Center for the Constitution, which, as we've learned, is an important center because the rest of the law school is a center against the Constitution. But in any event, I criticized President Biden for hewing to his campaign promise to limit his candidate search for Supreme Court by race and sex. And I didn't phrase it in the best way. It was late night with these Twitter hot takes, not a best practice. So it was definitely a failure of communication. I admitted that readily. But my ideological enemies went for my throat, went for my job, for my career. And that's how all this began.
So what happens next? You wake up in a hotel room in Austin, and then what?
I check my Twitter feed because, of course, this is the last thing we do at night, and the first thing we do in the morning is check our social media. It's trying to break that habit, and this thing has exploded. And as I said, I'd opened the door for people to attack me and to willfully misconstrue what I'd said as racist, misogynist. I was basically doing a critique of racial preferences, of affirmative action, that you should consider all possible candidates, as 76% of Americans agreed, at least according to a poll conducted by that rabid right-wing outlet ABC News. But anyway, as I said, I phrased it poorly. And at that point, it was damage control. It was crisis PR management. I was constantly talking to Professor Randy Barnett, who founded the center at Georgetown, great scholar, originalist. That began what I've called 4 days of hell, where my entire life, my entire career, everything my parents sacrificed to enable my achievements was crumbling because of one tweet. And I really learned who my friends were. I really learned the extent of, or began to learn the extent of the rot in higher education and the spinelessness and some of the failures of leadership of people like deans of so-called elite law schools. And after those 4 days, the dean did not say, I disagree with him, he spoke poorly, but we have academic freedom, faculty are free to do lots of things like this. Or he didn't retract my contract and take the slings and arrows of being attacked for being a censor. Instead, he punted to the diversity office, the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, to investigate whether I had violated university rules on harassment and discrimination. And thus began the transition from 4 days of hell to 4 months of purgatory. 4 months, right? You'd think at a law school, it's a tweet, right? Lawyers apply law to fact. The law, the policies are short, little paragraphs. The facts, the tweet is even shorter. assign it to the most junior law professor, and you'll come up with the result of your investigation rather quickly. But no, 4 months. At the end of which, again, he punted by saying that finding a jurisdictional defect, that is, that I wasn't employed by Georgetown yet when I tweeted, so the policies didn't even apply to me. Right.
And contrast that, if you would, against Mohammed El-Kurd, and who is he, and what did he say, and why does that matter?
This is a invited speaker at Georgetown who spoke while I was under administrative suspension. This whole period while I was employed in Georgetown, all but the last 4 days, I was under administrative leave. And Kurd, who's said all sorts of inflammatory, incendiary, anti-Semitic, illiberal, you name it, sorts of things, gets invited to speak there, and that's not problematic at all.
Well, you specifically cite on page 11, right? He says he accused Israel of unquenchable thirst for Palestinian blood, and he said that Israelis harvest organs of the martyred and feed their warriors our own. So that, no problem, right? And your tweet is a 4-month investigation, right?
There is a lot of, part of the issue with higher education administration is the unevenness, and even if the rules on paper or on pixels might be okay, which in many places they are in terms of protecting speech and due process, there are problems with those sometimes too. But even if they were perfect, they're applied completely unevenly, and that's just one example. Yes.
So this is why we're going into this. Is it's not just to dwell on this incident and what happened to you, but what are the broader implications? What did this make you realize about this world that you were formally entering this academic world, having been for many years at a leading think tank, the Cato Institute?
Right. So higher education is supposed to be about discovering truth and creating knowledge and passing on that knowledge to the next generation. But we've seen a shift from education to indoctrination or activism. We've seen a shift from protecting such basic values as academic freedom, freedom of speech, equality under the law, due process, to a subversion of those values in favor of a postmodern philosophical construct where your rights and freedoms depend on where you are in a privilege hierarchy, whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed, the undermining of all of the rules of the game on which American democracy, equality, prosperity lie, which is particularly dangerous in law schools, which after all train the next generation of the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions.
Yeah, so tell us why does this matter? Why should somebody who's not a lawyer, has never set foot in a law school, why should they care about what's going on in academia broadly, but specifically in law schools?
Well, it's bad enough if a Department of English or sociology goes off the rails, right? It gets taken over by the crits, the critical theorists, the critical, whether it's critical race theory or critical legal studies or what have you. That's bad enough for the creation of human knowledge, for the reputation of these institutions, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But law schools, if you look across our institutions, whether in government, whether outside the courtroom, obviously judges and prosecutors are going to be lawyers, but our Fortune 500 companies, our civic organizations, lawyers punch above their weight in terms of leadership of America's institutions. And so if the next generation of lawyers thinks that all of our institutions are illegitimate and need to be torn down and rebuilt according to an intersectional matrix or of power dynamics or what have you, that's dangerous indeed.
So,
and just to be clear, Dave, this is not my whole, what I discovered, what I've written about, what I speak about, is not just the latest iteration of a decades-old conservative complaint about the liberal takeover of the academy. Those hippies who took over the faculty lounge, the Berkeley free speech movement in the 60s, would now be considered retrograde white supremacists by today's radicals. It's this illiberal takeover that's so dangerous. Not just debating what the right policy is, what the right interpretation of a statute or a constitutional provision is, but the undermining, alleging that all of this is an illegitimate enterprise. That's a big deal.
You devote an entire chapter to something that happened at Stanford on March 9th, 2023. It's truly shocking. Why don't you walk us through what happened when U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Kyle Duncan came to Stanford that day?
Yeah, as bad as what's happened to me or other speakers on various campuses, here we have a federal judge coming to one of the very, very top ranked, prestigious law schools in the country. And he gets shouted down, and he gets, they were shouting, "We hope your daughters are raped." At a federal judge.
He was called scum.
It's with no consequence in the end.
And nobody was disciplined.
And members of the administration, far from preventing this from happening or trying to steer it in a more productive direction, egged on the mob and facilitated this kind of behavior.
Well, tell us about
shocking.
Associate Dean for DEI, Tieran Steinbach. I hope I pronounced her name correctly.
Yeah, so the students, by the way some of these things go on, it's just bizarre. This didn't happen, at least at my law school when I was there, over 20 years ago now. Sometimes it feels like I was in school, just yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a long time ago on a planet far, far away. But they were chanting and banging as if it was an Occupy Wall Street meeting. He couldn't get a word in edgewise, and then after a while he looks at, is there someone from the administration? Can you help out here? And this associate dean for DEI comes up, pulls out some prepared remarks, and starts castigating Judge Duncan for the harm that he's creating by his mere presence there. Mind you, he was not speaking or taking some controversial position on some culture war issue. He was talking about judging during times of uncertainty and what we do as lower court judges when the Supreme Court hasn't ruled on an issue. The very sorts of nerdy things that you would think students come to Stanford Law School to learn about from leading practitioners and judges. But no, because he's a social conservative, and when he was in private practice and as an academic had written things that some students found offensive, he was causing harm. And Dean Steinbach asked, is the juice worth the squeeze? The knowledge that you're here to convey, is that worth the harm that you're causing to all of us here? It's so bizarre. What harm? Is he, punching people? If you feel threatened by his mere presence, don't be there, it would seem to me. Have a protest outside, whatever it is. But no, they were there, and just, rude doesn't begin to, as you were alluding to get at what he faced. And after this, the then dean, now provost at Stanford, put out this 10-page memo, which you should all read. It's probably the best deanly or academic official exposition of the importance of the freedom of speech in academia that you've seen in recent years. But she goes on, Jenny Martinez, the then dean, now provost at Stanford, goes on to throw Dean Steinbach under the bus by saying she didn't practice DEI correctly, because real DEI respects freedom of speech, and it's so important. And there I part ways with her analysis, because whatever you might think about the words diversity, equity, inclusion, I think those are good words. Who could be against having different perspectives to prevent groupthink and enrich conversation? Equity is a centuries-old concept in Anglo-American law that just boils down to treating people fairly. Inclusion, do you want people not to feel welcome where they're at work or at school? No, so these are good things. The problem is, as applied by the professional diversicrats, I call them, of this industry. There are thousands of people who are members of diversity officers in higher education. This is an industry group.
You actually list several pages of titles of these people on page 64.
Of positions that were just created
Yes.
since the George Floyd killing.
It's actually quite a list. I recommend it to all. But so this happens at Stanford. As a law school graduate myself, not of Stanford, but it would have been inconceivable that a federal judge would be shouted down. I mean, somebody would have had to have been expelled or suspended or something, and nothing happened, right?
And nothing happened. And there were other incidents not involving federal judges, but just bizarre, outlandish things at Yale. The thing is, these are the tip of the iceberg. It seems like now the deans have figured out, okay, we need to enforce our policies against disruption and all that, but that's the least of the problem. I mean, that's what gets the news. Obviously, it makes a national sensation that a federal judge gets shouted down. It goes into the Wall Street Journal and all of these other things. But that is a symptom of pathologies going on underneath. The fact that students are chilled, that certain topics can't even be discussed, let alone certain perspectives on those topics. The fact that most law schools don't have any originalists on faculty, nor anyone that can in good faith even teach it.
So given that this is a broad audience, not a legal audience, what is an originalist?
Sure, yeah, it's, well, I'm sure some of you attended Justice Kennedy's event here, Justice Barrett's. You can watch those at home at your leisure. It's the basic idea that provisions of the Constitution should be interpreted based on their original public meaning. It's like a contract. When lawyers write a contract, people write that down so everything is clear and you know what everybody's rights and responsibilities are, the consequences of breaking that. And so originalism is just basic interpretation of the law applied to the Constitution. Textualism is something similar as applied to statutes. And originalism has unfortunately largely been identified with the political right, but isn't exclusively. But as I was saying, even though about half of the federal judiciary are judges who are originalists, many law schools simply don't teach that method of interpretation, which, forget about any political points or rule of law points, is doing a disservice to the students in terms of training up lawyers, right? And some of these other pathologies in terms of academic culture are a basic failure of education that way as well. If you're a lawyer, you need to be able, whether you're negotiating a deal or arguing a case to defend a client, you need to be able to see all arguments, all perspectives on a given issue. If you're saying that certain of those perspectives are illegitimate, can't even be discussed, certain interpretive theories, even if the judge likes that, can't be applied, you're going to create less effective lawyers.
So as we work our way towards talking about solutions, we've illustrated the challenges and the problem, but some of the ingredients that you talk about in the book. So one is an intolerant faculty. What else? Tell us about the administrators and about the students.
Yeah, so if I have to boil it down, kind of my elevator pitch on my book and my messaging more broadly about the problems in higher education, it's failures of ideology, which gets a lot of attention. We can talk about that, this postmodern theory, the critical legal studies, all of that. Failures of bureaucracy. This is kind of the less sexy stuff, but there's been an explosion of non-teaching staff in the last 25 and especially the last 10 years. And most of that, especially in recent times, has been in the DEI faculty. So when you have more administrators who are not raised in the professional norms or values of academic freedom, of scholarship, whatever problems there are with the faculty, which are many, and we can talk about that as well, the faculty no longer runs these places. They've delegated that responsibility to these administrators, who are the ones who are instilling these cultures that are breaking down or that are antithetical to basic university missions. And then the third failure is failures of leadership. Deans, presidents, provosts, department chairs, generally these are not woke radicals, social justice warriors, but they've gotten to their positions because they've been successful at navigating the incentive structure that's been presented to them. They're careerist bureaucrats, and they're spineless cowards. Not everybody, there might be deans in the audience I recognize, or academic officials, I'm not talking about you specifically, but to generalize based on what's going on in academia, in so many places, as was my personal experience with Dean Bill Traynor at Georgetown, they just refuse to get a grip on what's going on in their institutions. They'd rather placate the mob than take a firm hand to return the institution to what they're supposed to be doing in terms of education, research, civil discourse, modeling, for lawyers, what it is to disagree without being disagreeable, all the rest of that. So those failures are what have gotten us to where we are.
And are the students already indoctrinated when they show up, or is it a mix of some of them are up for grabs and others show up that way?
Well, that's definitely a problem. For law schools, obviously, you have students that have gone through undergrad and their failures in undergrad. Now, that doesn't excuse the deans. And I've talked to many, many deans in the last, this year since my book came out, but in the last few years as I've been working on these issues. And I say, I fully recognize your job is harder than it would have been 25, 30 years ago because colleges are failing as well. That doesn't excuse you. It means you have to work extra hard to imbue cultures of rigorous scholarship and academic freedom and civil discourse. Deans are very good at imbuing whatever values, cultures they want, be that public service, entrepreneurship, social justice, whatever. They can do that for intellectual freedom, for civil discourse, these very basic values.
You compare this to the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So what do you mean by that? Tell us more.
The Chinese Cultural Revolution was challenging existing structures and existing authorities. They would humiliate their professors. I mean, this was a student-driven thing. Humiliate professors for being politically incorrect, quite literally. And shaming campaigns, mob-like behavior. You talk about cancel culture, the Chinese Cultural Revolution was cancel culture dialed up to 11. And so there are very much these elements of people going along to get along or keeping their heads down so as not to be caught in the cancellation crossfire, and the leaders being unable or unwilling to police these inmates who have taken over the institutions.
So let's talk about very deliberately solutions. So what's the role of alumni, of donors, of state bar associations, of law firms? What's the call to action?
There's not one silver bullet, the gold reform, you do this and everything's fixed. It has to be all of the above. So alumni and donors, and not just, billion-dollar alumni, Bill Ackman or what have you, that are important. Universities, especially elite universities, care about rates, giving rates. So if that drops, 5%, that sets off alarm bells. Again, not just the amounts. If the amounts goes down 5%, that also matters, but the percentage does. If you write an email to a university official, especially if you get a few of your fellow alumni friends to sign on to that, that's going to matter because presidents and deans know that for every letter or email that they receive, that represents a certain multiple of alumni that are too busy to take that kind of step. So you have a role in doing that. And then other kinds of what economists would call exogenous shocks, so asymmetric responses, not just trying to use basic logic or letters to the editor to convince a dean or a president to act in the right way, but state legislatures where it comes to public schools, not dictating what is said and can't be said inside a classroom, but zeroing out these DEI offices or reforming other types of structures. Just like legislatures can say, well, at this school, we don't need to have engineering at every single state school. That's going to be our STEM school, this is our liberal arts school, et cetera. You can make those kinds of decisions that legislatures make all the time. State attorneys general, and then the federal government. We've seen the House Education Committee being very active in summoning presidents of universities, very effective to show what kind of bubbles they live in and the weaknesses there. And the executive branch. I think there have been some missteps in terms of tactics, but absolutely the federal government, the executive branch, the Department of Education, the Justice Department, needs to enforce existing civil rights laws that protect freedom of speech, that protect students against universities turning a blind eye to cultures of whether it be anti-Semitism or discrimination in various other ways, these unhealthy things that are going on. And the private sector has a role. Employers right? Employers don't want to hire students that yell at federal judges or who support terrorists. And so there's definitely a role to play there.
It's a very somber topic, but you went through this, your personal ordeal, with a certain sense of optimism. Is that fair to say? Or maybe were there places where you found some sources of hope or good cheer?
Well, like Justice Kavanaugh at his confirmation hearings, he said that he lives on the sunrise side of the mountain. And I try to live that way as well. You know, you do your best to play the hand you're dealt. And once I was past those first 4 days of hell, which really I wouldn't wish on anyone but the key instigators of this inquisition against me, I guess. Once I was past that, and I saw that I'd be able to provide for my family. I got job offers and support and various things. Once I saw that this was making national news and that this was something that I just started continuing to be myself. On advice of counsel, my lawyer said, don't talk about Georgetown or your dispute with them, but keep talking about the Supreme Court, talk about free speech, all these other things. And you just have to, you called it being a happy warrior, but it's resilience through humor is how I would put it. I kind of say that I make a living at the intersection of constitutional law and satire sometimes, and I certainly had to draw on those kinds of resources.
So what did you do with Georgetown? What was the outcome?
So at the end of the 4 months, Dean Traynor said that identifying this jurisdictional defect, they hired, by the way, Wilmer Hale, one of the most expensive white shoe prestigious firms in Washington, to advise them. Who knows what their legal bills were over this period. And at some point, I guess a junior associate looked at a calendar and found that out. And he said that, reinstating me, he reinstated me on this technicality, but then I got the report from the DEI office, which clearly they wanted to punish me, and they said that the next time that I offended someone with what I said or wrote, that would create a hostile educational environment, and I'd be back in the Star Chamber. And so after that, it was a weird weekend, discussing with my lawyer, with Professor Barnett, with my wife, who's a better lawyer than any of us. I realized that I'd have to resign, that I couldn't do the job I was hired to do, either inward-facing, in terms of teaching or student programs, outward-facing, writing, advocacy, media, that sort of thing. And so I wrote up what might be my best ever legal work, this 4-page resignation letter, which was summarized in the Wall Street Journal, as one does, and then announced my next move to the Manhattan Institute on Fox News, as one does. And away we went. And I've been using this platform, this spotlight that I didn't seek, but that I was thrust into, to shine a light on the rot in academia and what can be done about it. And of course, we saw soon after that that this became a very important issue in the national discourse after October 7th, after the Hamas attacks on Israel, where everybody was seeing that there was something wrong on campus that wasn't simply, oh, these crazy kids, they'll grow out of it.
Well, let's talk about the aftermath of October 7th. Obviously, there were the encampments. Campuses were in turmoil. Tell us about Columbia Law School and the reaction of the storied Columbia Law Review.
That's where you went, if I'm not mistaken.
I was on the Columbia Law Review as an editor.
Columbia in general, their leadership, what we saw after October 7th was a live experiment in how much leadership matters. And you can compare and contrast the actions of university presidents at Columbia, say, versus the University of Florida under Ben Sass, or Daniel Diermeyer, the chancellor of Vanderbilt, who were just made national news and gained national accolades by enforcing their very basic rules, which Columbia refused to do. And at the Columbia Law Review, the students sent a letter demanding that exams be canceled.
This is after the encampments were cleared.
After Columbia eventually, failed at negotiating with the Hamasniks. The building that was taken over, and they wanted burritos. I mean, it was just bizarre stuff that was going on that spring. And after the encampment was finally cleared, the Columbia Law Review said that this is so traumatic that we need to cancel exams and have reparations of various kinds. This reparations issue came up in the investigation of my tweet. There was a town hall where students were demanding reparations in the form of free lunch and crying rooms. Law students at elite schools.
We don't have a crying room at the Reagan Library. So have we hit rock bottom on this stuff, or do we have a ways to go?
So it seems like we're past peak woke in society writ large. There's obviously been a cultural vibe shift, and I don't just mean last November's elections. Just in terms of our political culture, the approach of big and small business, maybe the pandemic addled minds and acted as an enzyme to all of this craziness as well. It seems like as a society, the pendulum is swinging back. In higher education, it's not clear. We're very much in the eye of the storm, and there's not that counterbalancing political culture to push back on some of these excesses. So I think what will happen is some institutions where the leaders are more savvy and can read the winds will reform, and others won't. And we're going to see a shift in terms of prestige, in terms of applications, in terms of donations. Already, for example, the University of Florida has come out of this very well compared to, say, the University of Michigan. Or you've seen a shift from the Ivies and Ivy adjacent schools in the Northeast towards larger public flagships in the Southeast, the SEC and the ACC. I recognize now the ACC has California schools, and none of these football conferences mean much anymore by their names. But
which schools come to mind as bright spots in the darkness?
Vanderbilt, University of Florida, just large schools in general, these flagships, especially if people ask me, where should I send my kids? Luckily, I don't face this issue yet. Our oldest is 9, about to turn 10, so we have a ways to go. But the honors colleges of some of these big schools, and that are also creating centers for classical education, civics, excellence. Some places you can't reform the larger institution, but you can create an institution within an institution. UNC is doing this. Arizona State is doing this. This shift I call the problem of the cold and the scold, where people are leaving hostile ideological and meteorological climates in the Northeast and coming to the South.
You tell us about the bright spot. You mentioned Michigan, that it had challenges, but you also had a positive experience there, right? I mean, can you tell us about that?
Well, this also illustrates how some of these university leaders aren't going to be convinced, but they're going to be dragged, whether kicking or screaming, or just by seeing the writing on the wall to effectively do the right thing. In that month of March of 2022, when I had an event shut down at UC Hastings, which has since been renamed UC Law SF, because it turns out that Mr. Hastings did some politically incorrect things. There were Yale incidents, ironically an event shut down that brought together speakers from the left and the right that agreed on little other than the importance of free speech. I was due to speak at Michigan, and their dean basically read the riot act to leaders of all student organizations saying, we are not going to be Yale or Hastings, so cut it out. Here's our policies. You know our policies. We're going to enforce it. And I was there, and I had a very good discussion with a professor from Northwestern, and he and I also agree on very little other than the importance of free speech. I think his opening line was something like, Ilya said many more contradictory or controversial things than what was in that tweet. I mean, and he goes on to talk about my stance arguing for the unconstitutionality of Obamacare and all these. Anyway, it was a model of disagreeing and how to go very hard at each other while not subverting basic academic norms.
In fact, for some of the reasons you just state, we here at the Reagan Foundation and Institute created a Center on Civility and Democracy to promote civil discourse, find common ground, and strengthen our democracy through informed patriotism. So this is something we're working on as a foundation, not in the legal context, but more broadly.
Well, I'd be happy to help those efforts any way I can.
Good. Well, so let's look at other institutions that are in the fight. So you resigned from Georgetown, and you're at the Manhattan Institute. So what made you choose to go there? And for those who may not know, please tell everyone, share with everyone what the Manhattan Institute does.
Yeah, Manhattan Institute, or MI, is a think tank. It's about 45 years old, based in Manhattan, although I don't live there. I still live, I like to say I head up our elite Falls Church office in Virginia. The commute can be a killer, though, when I'm going down the stairs as my kids are going up the stairs. But it is a broadly center-right think tank. You won't really find ideological labels on our website, but we tried to promote good public policy for America's cities, where, after all, most Americans live, regardless of what your politics might be. We want to harness the entrepreneurial spirit. We want to reduce barriers to success, both personal, business, and otherwise. I was brought in to not work on some of these urban policy issues, but to round out the program by filing briefs in courts and giving constitutional commentary. It's great as a lawyer at a think tank, you get to interact with all your colleagues, because inevitably, whether they're working on tax policy or housing or crime or whatever it is, at a certain point, these issues end up in court, and more often than not, they end up before the Supreme Court sooner or later. And so it's been a great institution. I've been there 3.5 years now. Very dynamic, very much leaning into the fight over these important issues to make sure that America's freedom and prosperity are preserved and enhanced.
At several points in the book, you mentioned FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. What's their role, and tell us about them too?
They are basically what the ACLU used to be. They will defend anybody's speech rights, regardless of how offensive it might be on the left, on the right, or otherwise. They defend a lot of faculty of various kinds, but not just faculty. Originally, they were the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, but unfortunately, that remit has expanded because of the need for expansion to broader society. And they've long been good friends to me, one of my favorite organizations that I've not worked for myself, but they helped provide a lot of that early crisis PR advice that I alluded to. Even when I disagree with them, which I have occasionally in recent years, it's just they are people of honesty and integrity. Another good institution is the Federalist Society, which you may have heard of. It's an organization of conservative and libertarian lawyers and law students, and they're all about debate and discussion and bringing new, fresh perspectives to law schools and to broader society. I've been involved with them for a very long time, but they're under new leadership now. We've had a changing of the guard, and I think it's been pretty seamless and onwards and upwards.
And we here at the Reagan Library have been privileged over the last many years to host the Western Lawyers Chapter meeting every January here. So
I actually spoke at one of those some years ago. So while that was technically my first time speaking here at the library, but this is the first official, if you will, non-FedSoc sponsored one.
So in a moment, we're going to turn to questions, so please have a question ready if you're so inclined. President Reagan famously said that, I'm paraphrasing of course, but that we're never more than a generation away from losing freedom, right? Freedom can go extinct if we're not careful. Those are the stakes. How do you see this? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? We don't know, obviously, but if you had to speculate, are we a generation away from losing these freedoms?
Well, we always are. You know, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and I'm less pessimistic than I was when I left Georgetown 3 years ago. I wouldn't quite say optimistic, because there are green shoots. There are institutional reforms and recalibrations. And there's enforcement by external stakeholders, but it will take sustained pressure. In a lot of these places, there's kind of a defensive crouch, waiting to for this current wave to, ebb, and then maybe they can continue their illiberal project in a different way. But it's going to be a different kind of environment. In general, in our society, we're living in a populist moment. On campuses, that's all coming from the left. In society more broadly, that also comes from the right. But populism can threaten the rule of law, which is what undergirds everything that America stands for, and what President Reagan devoted his career to advancing.
Great. Let's turn to questions, and right here in the front. And please state your name and affiliation and your question.
My name is David Scheinpark, affiliation.
Self.
Yeah, to self. So because you made that tweet, if you went to London, would you be arrested? And to follow up on that, I was really shocked to what's going on in London in terms of, or England, in terms of free speech, and I'm afraid that cancer could have spread to here. What's your comment on that? Thank you.
Or Canada, which is where I immigrated first before coming to the U.S. Just the damn socialism keeps following me around. I'm going to have to fix that. That's a good question. I'm going to have to research that, because I actually am going to London in January. I'm taking my second son, who's soccer obsessed, to a Chelsea match.
And just context that was underlying your question, a comedian was recently met at the airport upon landing at Heathrow for having put out tweets that didn't fit with the prevailing orthodoxies around transgenderism, right? I think that was the issue, wasn't it? Yeah, right. So he literally got arrested. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very unhealthy thing. This has been covered a lot in the Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication, so you can read all about the very worrying developments. This is why it's so important for America to have not just a First Amendment written down in our Constitution, but a First Amendment culture that we don't want to lose by subverting these values to other things. But I don't know. I'm gonna have to research what the statute of limitations is and all these other things before going over there, and maybe from now until then refrain from tweeting too controversial things.
David, having known Ilya Shapiro for a long time, it is not easy to stump him. So congratulations. Who's next? Great, right over here.
Hi, I'm Jane Ann, and I'm an 84-year-old grandma Republican from Los Angeles. And I have a question. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to ask an expert with the Constitution. It is regarding gender identity. I have a transgender grandson who's a senior in college in Washington State. And quite frankly, I'm concerned about its future because our country seems to be overwhelmed with misunderstanding, misinformation, and quite frankly, very negative awareness of genders, and especially the transgenders. So I've wondered about your thoughts on this, the constitutional rights. Sometimes in our administration policies and things that we see locally and everything that just shatter my heart, that this group is targeted and made villains, and there's, been negative awareness recently with the transgenders. And my mission is to try to make this more understanding for people. The awareness can be, more open. And I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, at a very basic level, I think we should treat people with kindness, regardless of who they are. We're all children of God. We're all born with inalienable rights, as Jefferson wrote in the Declaration. And And the law reflects that. You shouldn't have fewer freedoms or fewer rights because of how you identify or how you want to live your life. And so it just, it doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want in the interest of fulfilling your own self-expression, because other people have rights too. And so there are conflicts that arise, whether in terms of sports teams or facilities, whether in terms of indications of gender on passports. That's a live issue now. And these, you have to weigh the relevant federal laws in each kind of context. And something that might be the law in one way in, say, an employment context might be very different than an educational context, just because of the way that the laws are structured in those respective areas. And so, just treat people with good faith and with kindness, and address the issues, and try not to get subsumed in ad hominem attacks, I guess, is how I'd answer that question.
In your book, you talk about the Overton window, which I'd invite you to share what that means to the audience, but also that essentially certain topics are off limits. So talking about transgenderism, if you have a certain point of view, could be off limits, right? So
the Overton window is basically the range of permissible policy expressions. And I talk about how in academia, in law schools, criticizing abortion practices or affirmative action could put you outside the Overton window, could get you shunned, could have various professional repercussions, which is not a good thing. And so the debate that we've been having in society over gender in the last number of years is another one of these sensitive and fraught areas. The Department of Health and Human Services just yesterday put out, I think, their supplemental report on mistreatment of children in gender clinics and things like this. And I think there's been a shift in scientific understanding and an understanding of how that discourse was politicized for too long, unfortunately. But more broadly, I think activists, and I think there's been a lot of discussion here that activists in the gender area have done the interests of people who question their gender identity a disservice by being so aggressive, and have ended up putting people in a worse situation than if they just allowed the normal cultural shift to adjust. But in any event, I haven't disclosed to you what my views on these various things are, but certainly you should be able to, at any law school in the country, have debates between people who think that anybody who calls themselves transgender has a mental illness, or anyone who has that view is a bigot, right? You can have those views without being drummed out of a polite society, I think.
Is there another question? Yeah, right over there.
So the left played the long game well through the institution, at least at the academy. What's your view of how the right should play that? The long game, that is.
Other kind of all of the above solutions, many of which I've already mentioned, include alternative institutions. So the University of Austin is a very interesting experiment. They just got, I think, a $100 million donation from Jeff Yass, who's a big supporter of school choice and other worthwhile initiatives, to be guaranteed to be tuition-free forever. They had the first 2 years guaranteed, but now it'll always be a tuition-free school. And so that's going to be, obviously, one of its comparative advantages. And that's one school. It's fairly small. It hasn't even been accredited yet, I think, fully. I think it's only provisionally. It's in the process. Peter Thiel is funding kids not to go to college at all and be entrepreneurs. So all of these are responses. But I'm not going to tell someone don't ever go to an Ivy League school, that they're all corrupt and you're not going to get anything out of it. There are reasons that you have to evaluate for you, for your kids, of what is the right fit for your future. But in terms of kind of the conservative movement or the conservative legal movement, there are different institutions. The conservative legal movement has been quite successful in the courts and in terms of getting ideas into society.
Should state attorneys general get more involved?
I don't think that's a prescriptive question. That's, empirically, they are getting more involved. Solicitor generals didn't exist until about 20 years ago. I think Jeff Sutton, who's now in the Sixth Circuit, was the first one nationally in Ohio, and then Ted Cruz made a name for himself as Texas Solicitor General. Those offices are very important in terms of pushing constitutional issues to the forefront, enforcing federalism and separation of powers and constitutional rights and things like that. So, and that's another area where the right has had a modicum of success.
Great. Is there another question? Right over here on the aisle.
At the Reagan Library, we promote that President Reagan, when he got out of college, he tried to get a job at Montgomery Ward's in the sporting goods department. He didn't get it. And that led to him getting into radio, which led to him getting into the movies, which, catapulted him into, obviously, the presidency. And the concept being bad things aren't always bad. You left the Cato Institute to take a short-lived position at Georgetown. Do you consider that to be, serendipitous?
I get asked that question a lot. Am I better off than I not had this controversy? And in many ways, probably financially, I am. But it was, those 4 days of hell. My kids could sense that something was wrong. It was a tough time. I'm not sure the ends always justify the means that way. And I didn't, I got a book contract. I'm on Substack, Shapiro's Gavel. You can all subscribe. I got, a platform to speak on in various ways. But I'm not at Georgetown. And now, it was never, my life's ambition to be on a faculty necessarily, unlike some academics. I talk about my friend Joshua Katz, who his vocation is to be a higher education teacher, and he was treated tremendously unfairly by my alma mater, Princeton, by our alma mater. So, I don't know exactly how to answer that question. All I know is to continue playing the cards I'm dealt, and the aphorism, when man plans, God laughs. I found there's been a lot of serendipity in my life and in my career, and so I just try to identify opportunities as they come and make the best of them.
Is there a question all the way in the back, right over there?
Hi, my name is Wes. Selfish question here. You're a parent, and you've learned so much through this experience, as well as your knowledge of academia. Any advice to parents or grandparents in the room how we can prepare our children in this environment, prepare them to go to college and come back with the same values?
Well, see how my kids turn out in 10, 20 years, whether I should be the one giving advice, knock on wood. Look, we have a lot of books around. I talk to my kids constantly about my family's experience. My dad passed 2 years ago, and I'm an only child of only children. So all of that ancestral history, the Pale of Jewish settlement, the Soviets, my dad was exiled after his dad was taken by Stalin's secret police, returned from exile, the immigration, all of that richness, and what does it mean, and why, I talk about the bad guys. My kids are 9, 7, and double 3, so I can't really go into too much detail about political theory yet, but, we try to talk, and I have a piece of the Berlin Wall in my study at home. In fact, I have a lapel pin from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I don't know if y'all have lapel pins here. I'd wear it, but I thought this was the closest thing.
You're not leaving here without a Reagan
Okay, very good,
Foundation
very
pin.
good. But transmitting that family lore, that I think illustrates things better than were I just to give them lectures on, this is the John Locke theory, and then you add Milton Friedman to do the economics, and stories are still the best way to teach kids.
So let's pick up on that. You obviously grew up in the 80s. You emigrated from the Soviet Union during Ronald Reagan's presidency. What does Ronald Reagan mean to you?
He's one of my personal heroes, and I say that not because I'm at the Reagan Foundation to pander. He did so much to reorient America, to bring America back, to make America great again, if you will. That was one of the slogans of his first presidential run, or his second presidential run, I guess, when he won. Winning the Cold War, affected my family directly, and the push for the values of liberty and the rule of law were so important. I feel that personally and deeply.
One last question in the back, and then we'll wrap.
And you know what, Dave? Another thing that, one other aspect you made me think of this when you talked about President Reagan's personal life. He did that tour through GE, speaking all over the place, and got to learn about America that way and talk to Americans and their concerns. In the last, more than 15 years now, I've gotten to speak at a lot of campuses, law schools, undergrad, and otherwise. That's been a tremendous privilege that I've had of the way that my career has developed. And I hope I've been taking from that at least a bit of what President Reagan got from his speaking tour.
Last question.
So good to see you here. Just a short time ago, Harvard University won a lawsuit against the Trump administration regarding the administration trying to penalize them by withdrawing certain monies from Harvard for research and development. What do you think of that approach, first off? Second off, the Trump administration approach. Second off, it seems like the left is always gaining victories by using the Bill of Rights against us. And I'm not sure how to contain that, since this was obviously their problem in failing to protect Jewish students from harassment and danger on the campuses of Harvard. And that didn't even work.
So we're ending with an easy question. I'll take your second question first. Justice Scalia used to say that what makes America unique, what makes it great, is not our Bill of Rights. Any tin pot dictatorship can have that. The Soviet Constitution of 1978 had all these glorious rights.
Justice Kennedy made that point when he came here.
Right. It's structure, it's rule of law, it's separation of powers, it's James Madison, Federalist 51, men aren't angels, and so we have to create a government to secure our freedoms and then force it to control itself. As long as we're enforcing all of the Constitution, and we can debate what that means, I think we're good to go. But the Bill of Rights is an important part of that. The 14th Amendment is an important part of that. Going to your first question about Harvard and more broadly the administration's approach to these schools, Harvard won largely due to process fouls, because there are ways to enforce our civil rights laws, including for violations of not protecting against anti-Semitism, but it's not by sending a demand letter and then pursuing it that way. There has to be an investigation, a laying of complaints, like a claim, like a lawyer would make when you're suing somebody, and then negotiating for remedies. And they've been doing that. The administration has been doing that, including with Harvard. They've settled with numerous schools along those ways. So if, I think there were tactical missteps that I alluded to earlier, if they had avoided those, I think their record in pushing these schools would have been better, and they would have prevented this dynamic that we've seen arise where the presidents of Harvard and Princeton can stand as leaders of academic freedom, pushing back against government excess when really they're pusillanimous. They are not standing for what higher education is, or what higher education ought to be and can be again if it returns to its roots of seeking truth. And that's what's become my mantra through this whole experience. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "Live not by lies." That's just to a T what this is all about.
Lawless, the miseducation of America's elites. Ilya Shapiro, thank you so much for being here. This was fun.